Do you want to know what it's like to hang out with MS-13 in El Salvador? Or how the Russian mafia fought battles all over Brooklyn in the 1990s?
Or what about that time I got lost in the Burmese jungle hunting the world's biggest meth lab? Or why the Japanese Yakuza have all those crazy dragon tattoos? I'm Sean Williams.
And I'm Danny Gold. And we're the hosts of the Underworld Podcast. We're journalists that have traveled all over, reporting on dangerous people and places. And every week, we'll be bringing you a new story about organized crime from all over the world.
We know this stuff because we've been there. We've seen it. And we've got the near misses and embarrassing tales to go with it. We'll mix in reporting with our own experiences in the field, and we'll throw in some bad jokes while we're at it.
The Underworld Podcast explores the criminal underworlds that affect all of our lives, whether we know it or not. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors. Today on The Prosecutors, we conclude our investigation into the JonBenét Ramsey murder. Who killed JonBenét Ramsey? Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my outstanding co-host, Alice.
Brett, it's so good to hear your voice, and we are outstanding in the sense that I feel like no matter what we conclude today, we will be out there standing alone, the cheese stands alone, and everyone's going to be mad.
Yes, Alice and Brett, stand alone.
Stand alone. Out there, standing alone in the rain. No, all joking aside, the engagement on this case has been through the roof. You know we love this. We love it when y'all engage. We love it when there's good, respectful discussion on the Facebook page. It's awesome to see. And but wow, this really struck a nerve with y'all. I'm not going to lie. It surprised me. I didn't expect this level of engagement and this level of such strongly held theories of who killed JonBenét. So with that said, just I'm going to tell y'all to have an open mind, but I don't know that's possible for a lot of people in this case.
Yeah, sometimes the gallery is kind of like an old west town with tumbleweed blowing down the main street, but that has not been the case over the last few weeks. It has been a lot of discussion, and it's all been great. People have been very respectful, a lot of different opinions, a lot of people who agree or disagree with the various things we've said. It's been enlightening for me. It's always nice because, we sit behind these microphones and we talk about what we think, and we're throwing things out there. And when you have as many people listening to us as we are blessed to have at this point, and people who are willing to write back and comment on things you say, it's that's a lot of people listening and poking holes and pointing out where there are weaknesses in your argument. It's really valuable for me. I've really enjoyed it. I've really enjoyed our patrons. I mean, I have added things to episodes based on what patrons said because they get our episodes early. And sometimes they'll point out things and they'll be, oh yeah, we should discuss that more. And so I'll throw something else in the episode for you guys who are listening live or whatnot. So it's been amazing. It's been great. We've really enjoyed it. It's been fantastic. Sad that it's coming to an end, but this is the last episode. No matter how long it takes, we are going to finish today. And we do have a lot to say. There aren't that many theories, but we have a lot to say. And so, I think as Alice said, keep an open mind. I kind of hate to do this, but I'm going to go ahead and say something that I think everyone should remember. And that's whatever conclusion we come to and whatever conclusion you have, I think the thing that has hung over this case since we began is the compromised crime scene, the mistakes that were made early on, the evidence that was destroyed. One of the reasons this case is so controversial is because so many things went wrong. So I would just say to remember that. Whatever conclusion we come to or whatever conclusion you come to, I think everybody should have an open mind, including us, because of the evidence and the way it came in. I hope one day we have a resolution in this case, but I do wonder sometimes if this is just going to be one of those that sort of remains forever unsolved.
Well, why don't we kick off our theories episode? I know you guys have been waiting patiently for this, with probably the most likely theory of what happened to JonBenét.
Yes, and Alice is obviously being facetious, because if there is one theory that we can all agree is incorrect, this is why we decided to include this, because we need something everyone can agree on. And I think the one thing we can all agree on is that JonBenét Ramsey is not Katy Perry. Yes, you heard that correctly. There is a insane internet conspiracy theory that JonBenét Ramsey is in fact Katy Perry. That Katy Perry, the famous singer. According to E! Online, and this is a quote, famous conspiracy theorist Dave Johnson posted a 7-minute video on YouTube in 2014 that claimed pop star Katy Perry is none other than JonBenét Ramsey, the child beauty pageant star who was murdered 20 years ago. The video is making its way around the internet once again, resurfacing the thought that the Roar singer really is a grown-up version of the young girl. Ramsey didn't die, Johnson claims. She just sacrificed her name for fame. Johnson notes that when a photo of Perry is placed over a picture of Ramsey, they look identical. He also claims that Perry's parents, Keith Hudson and Mary Perry, are in fact Ramsey's parents, only thinner. Apparently this is like a true thing. You know, this is not an April Fool's joke. This is not our Taylor Swift episode. And Katy Perry was actually asked about this at an MTV music event and reacted in the way that you would expect. I think, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time debunking this one. I think we could just go ahead and say that this one is not true. Elvis is dead, and Katy Perry is not JonBenét Ramsey. I realize the Elvis comment will probably generate a lot of controversy.
Come on, one controversy per episode, Brett. But what I think this does demonstrate is the intense media interest and the intense just kind of societal interest in JonBenét all these years later. Obviously, Katy Perry rose to fame decades after JonBenét was murdered, and yet people are still looking for her. And this is also the hopeful, this is like Maura Murray. This is like every missing person case that we have, where people want to believe that the person is alive and well and living their life somewhere else, magically on an island or, in another country, or in this case, a famous pop star in the middle of the media's eye. But it's wishful thinking is what it is. And I understand, because we all know how tragic this case is. And unfortunately, I wish JonBenét at 6 years old had the foresight to go camp out in another state for decades before she became an international pop star, but that didn't happen, as much as I wish that were true.
Yeah, I don't know what it is about conspiracy theories and famous people, but you see this a lot. These sort of really crazy conspiracy theories. I forget, I think Avril Lavigne. Is it Avril Lavigne that some people think died?
Oh.
And then there was an imposter who's been Avril Lavigne ever since then. I mean, I can't remember
Maybe.
exactly.
There's a couple of them, right? And they come up every now and then.
It goes all the way back to Paul McCartney and the Beatles, and how Paul is dead and Paul was replaced by an interloper. Anyways, I don't know. And there's people who actually believe this stuff. But anyways, we just wanted to start this with a moment of levity and a moment of, non-seriousness, so we can all agree on something before we dive into the actual theories. But Alice is right. I think there's some wish fulfillment at work here, and we see that a lot. And unfortunately, the cold, hard truth is this 6-year-old girl was murdered. She was murdered brutally, and that's something you just got to face. And it's disrespectful to her to try and pass off these theories, these crazy conspiracy theories, as having some basis in fact. So hopefully we do all agree that one is ridiculous. And with that, let's move on to the real theories about who killed JonBenét.
And they're each going to be as depressing as the next. But a lot of people think this, and the second theory, I guess, we'll discuss is that John Ramsey killed JonBenét to cover up his sexual abuse of her. So this theory is pretty straightforward. Either with or without the help of Patsy to cover it up. This theory is really not all that popular anymore because, honestly, there's just no evidence of sexual abuse in John Ramsey's past at all. He had another daughter. He is a well-known person in his society. He lives a relatively public life, as we detailed in that during the timeline, with his private home parties being published in the local paper. He's a pretty semi-public figure where he lives. And there's just absolutely no hint whatsoever that John has abused his older children with another wife or anyone around him. Of course, not every child abuser is to be known. There's always a first time they're discovered. But typically something this drastic where there's going to be a murder to cover up a sexual abuse doesn't come out of nowhere. Usually there are signs. And although initially there were some in the police who believe that John might have been abusing JonBenét, there doesn't seem to be anyone in law enforcement now who believes that John was responsible. So maybe a sexy theory at the beginning, but there's just absolutely nothing that points to the truth of this theory. And really, there's not much evidence pointing to John.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's so little evidence really involving John. Even the evidence that people point to against the parents tends to be focused on Patsy. And a few things about this. Number one, I do think it's significant that no one in law enforcement thinks it's John. I mean, people in law enforcement think it's Patsy. I mean, there's some people in law enforcement who think Burke might have been involved. But John is not really a focus, to the extent that when Steve Thomas wrote his book, even when he talks about the evidence of sexual abuse, he does not pin it on John. He pins it on Patsy. He thinks it's some sort of potty training gone wrong. And you got to remember, JonBenét Ramsey, she might have been 6 when she died, but she had regressed on her potty training. She was wetting the bed, and that was a problem that Patsy was dealing with. And so Thomas actually thinks that to the extent there was any evidence of sexual abuse, it was Patsy punishing her in some way for wetting the bed. That's his theory. It's a theory some people support. Obviously, there are people who think John's involved. If you read Cyril Wecht's book, which I read, that is his theory, that this was some sort of sex game gone wrong and that John did this. I think Alice has already explained why that is highly unlikely. There's no evidence that John's ever done this before. Now, granted, there's a first time for everything and people get caught. But remember, if this were a sex act gone wrong, this is not just simple abuse. This is some real sadistic stuff. The garrote that was used in this case, most people think was used as part of a sexual assault. So you'd have to believe that John is not only abusing his daughter, but doing so in a really horrible way. And you have to believe that he was doing that while having never done something like this before, while having not abused his older daughters, of which he has two, of having no instances of abuse with anyone in the community. Like Alice said, he's a semi-public person. He's coming in contact with people all the time. And it's not to say that, well, he's a semi-public person and he's rich and he's famous, so therefore he can't abuse people. No, that's not the point. The point is that he would have had lots of opportunity to do something like this. And in the wake of JonBenét's death, with all of the focus by the media and all the investigation and all the press, if there was anyone that he'd abused before, it would have come out by now. Even if it took a while, it's been 25 years, and there's not a hint of it against John. So there's no physical evidence to support it, and there's no behavioral evidence, for all those who like behavior, that he's ever engaged in this kind of thing before. So I think we can pretty much put John aside. I realize there are people who will wish we spend more time on John, but honestly, there's not much to say. If you have a theory that John did it, it's pure theory. It's not supported by evidence. Like, you can come up with a scenario in which he did it, but you're not going to point to any physical evidence at all that he was responsible. At best, you have him finding the body. That's the best you've got. Is he found the body? So maybe he did it. That's the best you've got. But you don't have any physical evidence that he was involved.
And the other thing, right, it's not physical evidence, but I know a lot of people are like, well, Brett and Alice, you said in a previous episode that if a blanket is covering a dead child, then the parents did it. Remember, that was a generalization, and it usually means it's someone who cares about the child. And usually parents care about the children, and we've talked about the statistics of parents being the aggressors in these sorts of cases, just because children typically have limited contact with other adults other than their parents. So just in terms of statistics, who is more around to commit these sorts of crimes. So keep that in mind. So just because JonBenét was found with a blanket covering her doesn't automatically mean the parents did it. It is a curious fact and it's important, but you can't run to court and try to convict John based on the fact that he found the body and there was a blanket on her. That's not enough.
Before we continue, we want to talk about one of our long-term sponsors, BetterHelp. It has been a rough time for us all between COVID and the unrest in the world. It is a stressful time, and look, it's hard to deal with it. And sometimes you just want to talk to somebody. And whether you're struggling with grief, relationships, stress, having trouble sleeping, meeting goals, whatever it is that you are struggling with, online therapy might be for you. BetterHelp is secure online therapy that offers video, phone, and even live chat sessions with a licensed professional therapist. BetterHelp will assess your needs and match you with your own accredited therapist in as little as 48 hours. And you don't have to sit in an uncomfortable waiting room. Therapists have a broad range of expertise which may not be available in your area, but BetterHelp is available for clients worldwide. BetterHelp is committed to facilitating great therapeutic matches, so they make it easy and free to change therapists if needed. Visit BetterHelp.com/prosecutors and join the over 2 million people who have taken charge of their mental health with the help of an experienced professional. The Prosecutors is sponsored by BetterHelp, and our listeners get 10% off their first month of online therapy at BetterHelp.com/prosecutors. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/prosecutors. The Prosecutors Podcast is brought to you by Progressive. What's one thing you'd purchase with a little extra savings? A weighted blanket, smart speaker, that new self-care trend you keep hearing about. Well, Progressive wants to make sure you're getting what you want by helping you save money on car insurance. Drivers who save by switching to Progressive save over $700 on average, and customers can qualify for an average of 6 discounts when they sign up. Discounts like having multiple vehicles on your policy. Progressive offers outstanding coverage and award-winning claim service. Day or night, they have customer support 24/7, 365 days a year. When you need them most, they're at their best. A little off your rate each month goes a long way. Get a quote today at Progressive.com and see why 4 out of 5 new auto customers recommend Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National annual average insurance savings by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2020 and May 2021. Potential savings will vary. Discounts vary and are not available in all states and situations. So moving forward, the next theory is that Burke killed JonBenét and the parents covered it up. I think this is probably by far the most prevalent non-intruder theory made popular by the infamous CBS documentary that we've talked a lot about. On the gallery, there was a poll about who did this. The gallery, by the way, is our Facebook page, for those of you who don't know. There was a poll about who did this, and Burke won. Burke was the top vote getter. So most of the people who listen to our show, at least is assuming that they generally fit the gallery voters in the poll, think that Burke was involved. So let's walk through this theory. The theory goes that Burke had an inappropriate relationship with JonBenét, driven in part by jealousy and in part possibly inappropriate sexual attraction. Whatever happened between the two, it led to Burke striking and severely, fatally wounding JonBenét. Perhaps it happened in the kitchen when JonBenét took some of Burke's pineapple that he was eating out of that bowl, and he instinctively grabbed that flashlight we've heard so much about and struck her on the head, fracturing her skull and leaving her fatally wounded. Burke had struck JonBenét before with a golf club about 2 years in the past, Though that appears to have been an accident, it was fairly serious to the extent that JonBenét had to have plastic surgery to deal with a scar that was left behind. Other people have theorized that it happened down in the train room, that it's possible the kids were down there maybe playing doctor and things went wrong. It's been said that Burke was an odd kid, an oddness that was demonstrated in the interview he gave with a child psychologist shortly after the murder, and people would say reinforced by an interview he gave with Dr. Phil only a few years ago. The parents had a motive to cover up the crime, lest they lose both kids in one night. And I think most people who believe this think that the parents were aware of what happened and that they were the ones who fashioned the garrote and used it on JonBenét to simulate an intruder. The grand jury impaneled in Colorado did not indict the Ramseys for murder, as we discussed, but what they did is sign a true bill for Patsy and for John that said, to refresh your recollection, on or about December 25th and December 26th, 1996 in Boulder County, Colorado, the two parents did unlawfully, knowingly, and feloniously render assistance to a person with intent to hinder, delay, and prevent the discovery, detention, apprehension, prosecution, conviction, and punishment of such person for the commission of a crime. And a lot of people have presumed that this person that they were rendering assistance to is Burke Ramsey. Now, we've discussed why we don't actually think this is the case, but let's take it at face value for now. Obviously, we know very little about what the grand jury was doing or why it reached this conclusion, or really even what this conclusion actually means, but the prosecutor decided not to bring charges in any event.
Yeah, Brett. First of all, I just have to say, this has got to be really devastating for a 9-year-old boy to face for his whole life, from 9 on until to this day. As we said, many people think Burke did it. I think the evidence is not there for it for several reasons. This was an incredibly mature and sadistic way of murdering JonBenét. And I understand, there's part of the theory is that the parents helped him cover it up. The binding of the hands above the head, the DNA, mixed DNA, right? Male DNA found on her underwear. These are all things that suggest a much more complicated and mature murder scene than I think a 9-year-old is capable of even envisioning, not to mention the fact that this was an incredibly brutal attack. There are rage problems with children. I see my kids throw rage tantrums all the time, and every child is different. I don't purport to know what 9-year-old Burke was like, but what we are accusing this 9-year-old boy of doing, and he was a pretty average to little 9-year-old kid. He wasn't a giant 9-year-old. Really, he looked like a child because that's what he was. To be able to inflict this amount of harm on JonBenét, especially her skull, is very, very difficult to imagine without leaving any sort of evidence behind to point that to the fact that it was him. It would have happened in the home, and there is nothing around the home, splatter, dents in the floor, the walls, anywhere that would suggest such a brutal attack happened in the home by a child. In 2016, when CBS ran a documentary fingering Burke, and from that point forward, he became the main suspect in the public's eye, he sued CBS for libel, and they settled with him. Now, is it possible Burke struck JonBenét and killed her? Sure, it's possible. But like we've talked about through these episodes, there's really no evidence he actually did. But for the sake of argument, how would such a theory look? Let's walk through it. First, what didn't happen? Burke didn't hit JonBenét in an elaborate sex game gone wrong in the basement. He also didn't drag her down there after hitting her in the head over some pineapple with a flashlight or a baseball bat and fashion a garrote to drag her with. By the way, let's talk about that. The reason that didn't happen is there's no evidence of her being dragged. There would be so much DNA and so much evidence along the way if he had done either of those things. Now, there are some people who put this theory forward, but there's no evidence of dragging, and the garrote was made of the paintbrush near where the body was found, not upstairs. Much more likely, it was fashioned there after JonBenét was already in the basement. And Burke did not write the ransom note. But maybe Burke did strike JonBenét in the head, and if he did, he needed help. And we can imagine how that would go. One of two things would have happened. Either he did it in front of his parents, or he struck JonBenét and then went to get his parents. Now, if he'd struck JonBenét and left her body somewhere else without telling his parents, they would have found her and likely believed that like a burglar struck her after she interrupted them, or some intruder did this. It's highly unlikely that the parents would stage a murder in this case if they thought an intruder had done this to JonBenét. Moreover, in this case, the Ramseys would have found JonBenét's body much closer to when the 911 call was made, sometime after they woke up that morning. They would have had far less time to garrote her, write the note, call the police, and you would not expect that JonBenét would have been found in such an advanced state of rigor mortis if she died much later in the night. Remember, she was alive when she was strangled.
And I think those things mean that either this happened in front of the parents or Burke came and got them after things went wrong. As Alice said, they didn't wake up and find her body and realize Burke had done it and do all this. They didn't wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning and find her body and do all this. That just didn't happen. It's not possible. So it means Burke either did it in front of them or he came and he told them. And so you can imagine Burke waits until his parents are asleep. He goes down to play with his toys he'd gotten for Christmas. Maybe he cracks open the refrigerator and gets his favorite snack out, some pineapple that he pours into a bowl. But when he goes back into the kitchen, there's JonBenét eating his pineapple, and Burke, in a rage, strikes her with a flashlight that was sitting on the table. She falls to the ground, horribly injured. Realizing what he's done, he runs and he gets his parents, and they decide they have to save their oldest son. So, according to this theory, rather than calling an ambulance or calling the police to try and save JonBenét, they take her body down to the basement, they fashion a garrote, they strangle her, but before they do so, they sexually assault her with what's left of the broken paintbrush. And then after disposing of the evidence, they call the police. And that's what had to happen, right? You have two parents who have just found out that their son has fatally struck their daughter. They are devastated, heartbroken. They aren't murderers in this scenario or even child abusers. They are just parents faced with an immense tragedy, and in that horrible scenario, faced with losing both children, they did what they had to do.
But why the sexual assault? You don't have to have a sexual assault to convince the police it was an intruder. Sometimes people rob houses and kill people. That happens. And for parents to intentionally do that to their dead daughter, of course, anything is possible. I get that. But there is no indication that Patsy and John were parents who would allow something like this to happen typically, right? They were, by all accounts, very present, very loving, caring parents to both their kids, all their kids, John's older children with another wife. And so you would have to ask, the question is not, is this physically possible to do? You have to look at the body of evidence here, and there's no indication that they would be parents who would do something like this. In this scenario, where the parents are merely covering for their child from an accident or a fit of rage, there's no indication that they're psychopaths. But to do this and then to write the note, they would have to be psychopaths. And that's assuming that JonBenét isn't fighting back against the garrote, as the evidence may indicate she was doing. And why would the parents jump to the conclusion that they need to do this? There's no external evidence that JonBenét is fatally wounded. Burke has struck JonBenét before with a golf club. They didn't stage a murder then, and Burke wasn't arrested for assault when they took her to the hospital. So why would they react differently this time? They are staging a murder here to avoid a trip to the emergency room. And remember, we talked about the head wound, which in this theory, Burke would have caused the head wound. There was no outside evidence that the head wound was as serious as it was until they did the autopsy. So to them, even if she were unconscious, they would have thought Oh, gosh, you knocked her out. We got to take her to the hospital. And then if they start thinking, well, she's dead, we need to garrote her, and she starts fighting against them, why would they continue if she were fighting against them? Because the cover-up was just if they thought one child had killed the other. She's clearly not dead if she's fighting against the garrote. But even if you think they would do all this in this situation, there is another problem. This theory is typically based on the presence of pineapple. But if JonBenét ate the pineapple and then was struck by Burke with such viciousness that it smashed her skull, then her death was imminent. But the pineapple in her stomach was digested to the point that some even speculated she could have eaten it before the family left for the party that night. But whatever the case, it wasn't eaten in the immediate time before she died. The theory that Burke is responsible for JonBenét's death is simply internally inconsistent and falls apart upon even the slightest inspection. But perhaps the biggest strike against this theory is that the parents immediately let Burke out of their sight. Remember, he supposedly was asleep, whether pretending to be asleep or actually asleep, when everything was going down in the morning. And then he woke up, they got him dressed, and pretty soon after that, he was sent off to the White's house with other people, other adults and other children. He was interviewed by the police. He went back to school soon after all of this occurred. It's impossible to believe that if the Burke theory were true, one, the parents wouldn't keep him close in order to keep him quiet. And two, given what they actually did, that he would never say anything to anyone that revealed what really happened.
Yeah, I mean, 9-year-olds can't keep any secrets, much less a secret like this. I mean, this to me is, it's just almost impossible for me to believe that Burke never would have said anything to anybody about this. It just blows my mind to think that.
Even if they did the cover-up away from him, even if he had no idea that the parents did the cover-up, he would have known that he hit her, and then something terrible would have happened to her, and he would have probably heard his parents in a frenzy, right, trying to plan what to do. So even if he didn't see what they did to her, he would have known, I didn't do that to her. Like, whatever happened to her down there, how she was found is not what I did to her. So I heard my parents, though. So even if he didn't know the full story, he would have known enough, and it would have come out, whether playing with friends at the White's house that morning after her body was found, speaking to the police. We actually see this a lot in our child victim witness interviews. The parents want to be there and they want to hover. And for that reason, we separate them, right? We don't want the parents influencing what the kids have to say, especially if the kids have something to say that is incriminating against the parents. This is like a rule for all witnesses when you talk to them. You don't interview witnesses together because you don't want their stories influencing each other, but certainly not with someone who exerts power over a child because they may feel intimidation and not feel at will to say things out loud. There is no indication here that they tried to shelter him or keep him away from anyone around him to speak to him for fear that he would blurt out the truth of their murder cover-up.
Yeah, it's impossible for me to believe that they did all this to cover this up, and then they just sent him off. I can't imagine they would do that. They would keep him right there to make sure he doesn't say anything. He might never leave their presence again.
And Brett, it would actually be a really easy excuse. My dear baby girl's been murdered. They're going to come for my son. No one gets to be around him but me, right? It's a pretty easy cover-up of why you would be keeping him close to you and not letting him talk to anybody. But they never did that.
Yeah, and people say that the fact they sent him away as evidence, it might be evidence that Patsy did it and he didn't know anything about it. It might be evidence of that, and so she knew there was no danger to him, so it's fine for him to leave. But it's not evidence that he did it. There's no way it's evidence he did it. It is strong evidence against the fact he did it. And you combine that with a sort of lack of evidence, and to me, the theory falls apart. Now, before we move on from this, I do want to talk more about this CBS documentary that we've talked about this whole time. You know, I've been very critical of that documentary. Number one, because they lied to you about what it is. It's not a new investigation. It's a rehashing of old information. Number two, because many of the so-called experiments they do aren't real experiments. They would never be able to introduce those in court. And I know there were a lot of famous people on there and a lot of really good witnesses, expert witnesses on there, but they weren't testifying at trial. And I think that's important. Dr. Henry Lee, I don't think he ever would have gotten up on the stand and testified to the things he said on the CBS documentary. I just don't believe he would have. I don't think Werner Spitz would have either. I think there's a difference between when you're being paid to be part of a Hollywood production and when you're paid to be on the stand. You know, that documentary has things like they're testing the stun gun theory, and they do it on a grown adult. I realize you can't test the stun gun on a 6-year-old, but when you stun gun somebody who's an adult who weighs 200 and something pounds, you're not going to get the same results as if you do it on a child. And it's stuff like that I just keep coming back to. And one thing I want to talk about, again, we talked about it briefly before, is this 911 call. If you've seen it, and we talked about this, the program suggests that there are sounds in the background of the 911 call as it ended that are actually voices. And CBS suggests that you can hear Burke saying, you know, what did you find? And you have John telling him, we're not speaking to you. And the theory there is that Burke is sort of sheepishly asking about JonBenét, and John, who's angry about what he did and what they're having to do, is telling him, we're not speaking to you. And that's sort of like, oh, well, there you go. There's proof. But there's a couple problems with it. First, as we've said, the Boulder 911 used recycled tape to record the calls. Trying to discern words from hisses and pops in the background is always going to be a fool's errand. Secondly, both the Secret Service and the FBI have analyzed this tape. They got nothing. The CBS documentary tries to trick you into thinking that its stars are discerning these words in real time. In reality, this analysis comes from something called the Aerospace Corporation. It was done back during the original investigation. You can read about it in Steve Thomas's book, and you can read about their analysis indicating these same lines in that book. There was nothing new about that in the CBS documentary. They just wanted you to think there was. But the biggest problem isn't the technology problems with trying to discern this conversation out of static. It's what is supposedly said makes no sense in the context of the theory. As we've said, if Burke is responsible for this, his parents could not have merely found JonBenét Ramsey. And they wouldn't have found her so late in the game. If Burke did it, he knew well what they had found because he had either shown them what had happened to JonBenét in the first place, or they had seen him do it. Moreover, as we just said, if Burke did kill his sister, his parents better be talking to him and explaining that he can never tell anyone what he did. What you would hear on that tape if Burke did it would be the Ramseys telling him that he could never speak of this again. And, you know, we started this off with a riddle, and we started off with a riddle for this reason. The Burke did it theory is the wrong answer to the riddle. Because what I think people are doing here is they really think that Patsy wrote that note. And they really think that the parents are responsible for the murder, but they cannot believe that the parents would have wrapped that cord around their daughter's neck and choked the life out of her after an accidental strike led to this head injury. They can't believe that. And so they invent a reason. They invent a reason that they would do that. And the reason is that Burke did it. And it's a theory that gives a reason for why the parents acted that way, but there's no evidence for it. Just like there was no evidence in the riddle that the man at the funeral was really the sister, or that the man was having an affair with the sister, or anything like that. Those are reasons that people make up to justify something they can't imagine. And I think a lot of people cannot imagine why the parents would do this, and so they make up a reason that allows them to believe it happened. And that reason is that Burke did it. And it's not based on evidence. It's not based on proof. It's based on a desire to believe that the parents could not have been responsible for this crime. Guys, I gotta tell you, running this podcast can be a lot of work. And I know those of you out there with a small business or a side gig, you understand how much work it can be. A lot of you guys are just like us. You have a regular job you're working, and then you come home and you do what you're passionate about. And if you can save time, that is the most important thing to you. And time is money. Don't waste either with repeated trips to the post office, and that's where our sponsor, Stamps.com, comes in. With Stamps.com, you can skip the trip and focus on how to take your small business to the next level. Stamps.com lets you print official postage right from your computer and saves you money in the process, so you can spend less time at the post office and more time making your customers happy. Whether you're an office sending invoices, a side hustle on Etsy, or a full-blown warehouse shipping out orders, Stamps.com will make your life easier. All you need is a computer and a standard printer, no special supplies or equipment. You're up and running in minutes, printing official postage for any letter, any package, anywhere you want to send. So stop overpaying for shipping with Stamps.com. Sign up with promo code prosecute for a special offer that includes a 4-week trial, free postage, and a digital scale. No long-term commitments or contracts. You have nothing to lose but the hassle and the lost time of going to the post office. Just go to Stamps.com, click the microphone at the top of the page, and enter code prosecute, and understand why we love Stamps.com.
Brett, should we just leave that incredibly steaming, controversial plate and move on to another very controversial thing?
I think that's probably the best bet.
Please keep listening. But I mean, truly, we know that there are a lot of people who fall into this camp of believing Burke did it. Ask yourself where the evidence is for that, and walk yourself through what must have happened. I think when you do the exercise of walking through the actual events of the night, if Burke had done it, each step becomes more ridiculous as to why the parents covered it up. And really, the Burke did it is just an excuse to be able to point to some reason because they can't really make sense of why the parents would do it in the first place. It's to force the issue of there must have been a cover-up, and you kind of have to create a reason for why there needs to be a cover-up. So intense that the parents would stay silent even if they were not the ones to kill her. So we'll move on from that for now. I'm sure there will be more discussion, maybe on a Get Vocal. Another theory is that Patsy Ramsey killed JonBenét in a rage over bedwetting or because she no longer wanted to be a beauty queen. Now, if someone in the family killed JonBenét, it was Patsy. John simply helped her cover it up, either inadvertently or in an effort to protect what was left of his family. This is the favorite theory of the Boulder police. Steve Thomas, a narcotics officer who headed up the investigation as Boulder had no homicide detectives, is the lead proponent of this theory. The idea is that Patsy grew frustrated and angry with JonBenét's continued bedwetting and either struck her or pushed her such that she fell and struck her head. Now, at that point, Patsy staged the rest of the crime, including the writing of the note to cover up what she had done. The evidence for this theory is scant, as we have discussed. In some ways, this is an argument from absence. There's not enough evidence of an intruder to believe one could have been in the house. There's no evidence that John or Burke killed JonBenét. There are some fibers on JonBenét's body that match her mother, including possibly on the piece of duct tape. The note, at least according to some experts, bears some strong indications that Patsy wrote it. So that's the argument for the theory that Patsy killed JonBenét.
So let's talk about the argument against it. First, if it was an accident, you still have to believe that an otherwise ordinary woman who loved her daughter would nevertheless sexually torture and garrote her just to cover up her involvement in the death before draping her in her favorite nightgown and blanket. It's one thing to believe Patsy would plant the body downstairs. That's something I could believe. It's another thing to think she would do what she would have had to have done for her to be responsible for this crime. But put that aside, maybe you think she could. We've obviously talked about parents before that have done terrible things to their kids. But the timing is wrong, too. Simply put, why would Patsy have been up with JonBenét in the middle of the night? Yes, JonBenét wet the bed, but Patsy's habit was to change her and the sheets when she woke up in the morning. We haven't seen anything where JonBenét would wake up in the middle of the night and tell her mom and the sheets would be changed then. So why would she be doing it at 1 or 2 in the morning on this day? And it would have had to have been early on. Obviously, she would need time to stage the scene. Writing the letter alone probably took 30 minutes. It couldn't have been something she did first thing in the morning when she woke up. And you have the problem of rigor mortis. If she had killed her this late in the game, you wouldn't have seen the level of rigor mortis you saw even at 1 o'clock when the body was found. Then you have the oversized underwear that we talked about. Those who think Patsy killed JBR think she's lying about the underwear, that JonBenét never wore them. But why would Patsy grab oversized underwear and put them on JonBenét? If the fight was the result of her wetting the bed, it's likely she would never have changed her. She would have had the fight, JonBenét's head would have been struck, and then the rest happens. If it was after she changed her, there's no reason for her not to put her in her normal underwear, and it doesn't seem like, if Patsy went through the whole process of changing her, that the rage would be fresh enough for her to cause this serious injury that we see. The oversized underwear seems like it's either something JonBenét truly preferred, which is what her mom said, or the mistake of an intruder. And even if Patsy did strike JonBenét and believed she'd killed her, why garrote her? If she were dead, what's the point in adding this flair? Was Patsy so sophisticated and accidental murderess that she thought someone bashing in JonBenét's skull as an intruder wasn't enough, that she needed to add sexual torture and strangulation to the mix? And if JonBenét struggled, or if she showed any signs of life, then you have to believe that Patsy, who up to this point had shown no indication of violence towards JonBenét, decided to murder her in the most brutal way possible to prevent questions at the hospital when asked how she got a knot on her head. Because remember, she would not have had any reason to believe the damage was as bad as it was. Is it possible that all these things happened? Yes. Is it likely? Probably not. Can you ever prove it one way or the other? No. I can't tell you definitively that Patsy didn't do this. I feel about as confident as I could be that Burke didn't do this, but I can't tell you Patsy didn't do it because, as we said at the very beginning of this episode, the evidence is so compromised. But the evidence we have does not seem to indicate that Patsy was involved.
And real quick, I know a lot of people who really believe Patsy did it have been, writing on our Facebook wall and whatnot saying, I can't wait for them to make the case against Patsy. Here's the problem. We can't invent evidence and we can't analyze evidence that isn't there. And so we're giving you the best argument. And part of the problem is there is not much evidence. I can't tell you that the DNA fibers, definitively rule out anyone. I can't make a sophisticated evidentiary argument against any of these theories because of the just utter lack of evidence across the board. And I know we said this at the beginning, and we'll say it again at the end, but just know that. So if you find the argument against lacking, it's true, but it's also in some ways equally as lacking as the argument for the fact that Patsy did it. So keep that in mind as you analyze for yourself, each of these theories. Let's talk about the last theory we'll discuss before we jump into our theories. An intruder did it. If it's an intruder, it could be anyone. It could be someone who saw JonBenét at a pageant or someone who saw her at a community event related to these pageants. There have been a few suspects named over the years. Michael Helgoth, a man who committed suicide 2 months after the murder and 1 day after District Attorney Hunter issued a statement that the authorities were narrowing their search for the murderer of JonBenét Ramsey. Indeed, a stun gun was found near Mr. Helgoth's body, as well as boots with a high-tech logo like the one left on the basement floor of the Ramseys' home.
Which already is more evidence than against Patsy. I just want to say.
That's fair. That definitely is fair. But also like a random person, right? If in fact we kind of rounded up everyone in the, I don't know, let's just say give a random 100-mile radius who had a stun gun and high-tech boots, that may be a lot of people. I don't know. But you are right. That actually is more evidence than against Patsy or Burke. There was also Gary Oliva, a transient with a history of child molestation who had who was seen in the Boulder area in December 1996. He picked up his mail 1 block from the Ramsey home and was present at a memorial service for JonBenét. The Ramseys named Robert Wolfe in their book, Death of Innocence, which led to the federal lawsuit in Georgia. In addition to strange behavior in the days surrounding the murder, as recounted by his girlfriend, Wolfe also had a hat and sweatshirt with the initials of the Santa Barbara Tennis Club on it, or SBTC.
And for all 3 of those are just 3 random suspects. We don't normally name suspects, but in this case, just to show you some of the people we've looked at, and to show you, frankly, kind of the weakness of the evidence even with these people. You know, I joked that there's more evidence against Helgoth than there is against Patsy, but there's not a lot. As Alice said, there's probably a lot of people who fit that profile. You know, Oliva, however you pronounce his name, he's sort of a round up the usual suspects, right? He's someone with a history of child molestation who's in the area, someone the police undoubtedly looked at, and just someone who sort of fits the profile. And then Wolfe, you know, not a lot of strong evidence there. Really, I think the only reason he's been named as a suspect is because the Ramseys considered him to be one, which led to a lawsuit, which produced that opinion that we've looked at before. So not a lot of great evidence against these folks. They are all random people. They don't really have any connection to the Ramseys. And I question whether or not, if it is an intruder, it is someone who is random. Now, I'll tell you, my understanding is John Douglas, who we've talked about a lot, his analysis of this case for the Ramsey family concluded that it was a random intruder, that this was someone who was a violent sexual offender, who saw an opportunity and took it. Far be it from me to disagree with him, but I don't think that's true. I think this was somebody who probably knew the family. This is probably someone, if it's an intruder, who is connected to the family. I mean, these people we talked about, they're as speculative as the parents, but more so, we can at least put the parents on the scene, right? And I know that's what a lot of you are saying. Well, the parents were there. They're obviously better suspects. And in some ways they are. They were in that house that night. And we can't say that any random person was in the house that night. If it were an intruder, the target is likely a combination of John and JonBenét. The person obviously had some sort of pedophilic tendencies given the sexual abuse that we see. That's not just something somebody does. It's not something that you just decide to try out for the first time. This sexual torture of this girl. I mean, just some brutal stuff that is being done to her. So I think it is somebody who has some sort of pedophilic tendencies, whether or not they've ever shown, whether you can find an arrest record for them or not. I do think if you found this person, you would find other victims of them. I don't think this is the first time that they abused a child. But they also obviously had it out for John. The letter makes that clear, and I don't think they are bluffing. The beginning of the letter, as we said, actually says some nice things about John, but by the end, it's mocking him. It's interesting that it never mentions JonBenét's name, and one wonders if the person even knew her name. And the fact that the killer mentions John as Southern is intriguing. Someone who knew of him, or only knew him casually, or possibly only knew him through a business relationship or a social relationship, might associate Atlanta with him, but not someone who was his family, not someone who knew him well. John was from Michigan. It was Patsy who was attached to Atlanta. It was Patsy who had family in Atlanta and connections there. Could this have been a cover by Patsy? Throw that line in there to throw people off? Maybe, but it's an awfully interesting thing to think of in the heat of the moment as opposed to with hindsight. It seems like the kind of thing that whoever wrote it probably believed. In my opinion, this intruder, when they committed this crime, is almost certainly a male in his 20s or early 30s. I think the movie references in the letter are telling. Remember, unlike today, you couldn't just look those lines up on the internet. If you knew them, it was because you had seen the movies many, many times. You also couldn't just pull them up on Netflix. You had to go rent them out at the local Blockbuster. This is someone who has probably watched those movies repeatedly. If the cops had gone to the local Blockbusters and gotten the names of people who rented those movies, they might have found the suspect right then. If this person were the same age today, they'd hang out on 4chan and trade Pepe the Frog memes. In 1996, they watched Dirty Harry and Speed and imagined how they'd commit the perfect crime, and then they saw an opportunity, and that's what they did.
We're about to dive into our own theories, and it's going to, I think our discussion is going to lean heavily on this intruder theory. I think the questions with the intruder theory, it is a massive catch-all theory. The intruder theory is actually many theories within it, right? Because it is whether this is a random person, someone who's tied to them, whether JonBenét was the sole target, or if it was something bigger than that, or if it's something bigger than her, if it was the whole family that they were attacking. And obviously who it was. Was it someone who knew them, but the family didn't know the perpetrator? That's possible. They were somewhat of public figures, we've noted. Is it someone they knew intimately? Maybe even one of the 30 people who had a key to the house. And so when we say intruder theory, it's actually a massive theory that catches a lot of things, because really there's two camps, and we've said this all along. It's intruder or someone in the family. And I mean, Brett, I think we've reached that point. We've, dragged this out 9 episodes? What do you think happened?
Well, I think I've made my opinion pretty clear in this episode and maybe in prior episodes. I think an outside intruder did this. I think it was somebody who knew the family. I don't know how well they did. I think they considered themselves aggrieved by John. I think they told themselves that the reason they were doing this was to get back at John because they didn't want to admit their sexual attraction for JonBenét. I think they broke into the house. I'm not sure how they broke into it. I don't know if they came through that window. I don't know if they came through one of the many open doors or if they used one of the many keys that was out there, including the key in the hideaway. But I do think they were in that house. I think they were in that house that night. I think they were in that house while the parents were away. I think they used that time to learn the layout of the house to the extent they hadn't already learned it in things like the Parade of Homes, where people went through the Ramsey house pretty much free and clear. I think they figured out where JonBenét's room was. They figured out where this room was, where they would commit this crime. I think they realized it was a room that was very far away from anyone else, that no one would hear them. I think they found the light switch so they could turn the light on, and then they waited. They possibly wrote the note while they were waiting, and they just hung out. And then when the family got back, they executed their plan. It's possible it's someone that JonBenét knew. It's possible that this was the Santa Claus reference and that she thought this was Santa Claus coming to visit her after Christmas. It's also possible it was someone who used a stun gun. I think it had to be something like that, because if JonBenét was taken without either going willingly or being knocked out, then obviously the parents would have been alerted. Is it possible someone struck her in the head to knock her out while she was in her bed? Yes. Famously, that is something that Ted Bundy would do both early and late in his career. His MO actually changed, but early on, he would go into people's rooms while they were sleeping, and then he would beat them while they were asleep until they were dead, and then he would sexually assault them. You could imagine someone coming in with a bat and striking JonBenét to knock her out, and then taking her downstairs where they continued this attack. Maybe they didn't even realize the amount of damage they had done to her. It's also possible they always intended to take her, but then they realized, maybe they did come in through that window and they realized, I can't get her out. And so they decided to go ahead and live out their fantasy there in the basement where they knew they wouldn't be interrupted. I think the damage was done by something like a bat. Several of you who've reached out, who are in the medical profession, and the universal opinion has been that a bat is the most likely thing that caused this. People tend to think, at least the doctors that have reached out to us, that this strike, if it were done with a bat, it's more likely not to break the skin and cause bleeding than something else, such as a flashlight. The opinion was pretty much universal that a flashlight probably would have broken the skin and would have caused bleeding. And no one that we've talked to really even thinks it's possible that this could have been done through an accident in that room by Patsy either throwing her across the room or pushing her down and her head striking the edge of, say, where the bathtub is. And most people we talked to, all the people we talked to, thought that would also cause bleeding and that it wouldn't do the kind of damage that you see. So a baseball bat's a pretty popular guess on this. We'll never know the exact details of what happened unless this person is identified. I do think the DNA provides an opportunity. the DNA, which doesn't match anyone in the family and seems to match a third person in 2 different places. There's testing going on right now, and who knows, this might be the year when this crime is solved. But no, I don't think the parents killed JonBenét. Burke didn't kill JonBenét. The parents didn't write that note. It boggles the imagination to believe that they strangled JonBenét while she was conscious and struggling for life, or even in an attempt to cover this up. And look, if you believe the parents or Burke are responsible, then I think you should look at those photos. I think you should look at her skull. I think you should look at the garrote. I think you should look at that cord wrapped around her neck. And I think you should decide whether or not, number one, you think a 9-year-old, a scrawny 9-year-old, and I don't care what they showed in the CBS documentary with pig skulls, that a 9-year-old like Burke could do that damage to JonBenét, and that the parents, not in a rage, but in a cover-up for any reason, could tie that garrote around their daughter's neck with her hair stuck in the knot and everything else. And I'm sorry, but I can't believe that. I don't believe it. I believe parents do terrible things to their kids. And we've seen cases where they've done that. I mean, if you've looked at the photos in the Darlie Retier case of her children, or if you've looked at the kids in the Dr. McDonald case, you've seen evil just as stark as it could be, what they did to those kids. That happens. But remember, no one argues this is a premeditated murder. No one argues this. At best, it was an accident. At best, it was a cover-up of an accident. And I'm sorry, you will never convince me that the parents, as part of a cover-up, did that to JonBenét.
So, Brett, I don't think our theories are going to differ too much. I also agree that this is likely an intruder case. For all the reasons you listed, I do not think the evidence points in any way to the family, not to Patsy, not to Burke. The evidence isn't there for a, as you said, non-premeditated, horrendous murder of this 6-year-old. Rather, I'll tell you where I think I may diverge a little bit from you on the intruder theory. I do not think that the family knows who it is, like to this day. I do think it is someone who knew the family well. I'm not sure that the family knew this person well, though. Whether it be someone who worked on their home or went to all of the pageants in order to watch JonBenét, or simply read obsessively articles about John and his business and his family and his wealth, and was fascinated to the point of stalkerism of kind of the Ramseys' lifestyle. I think he knew their movements very well. But again, whether the Ramseys knew this person well, I do not know. The reason I say this is I do think that this person had been in their home multiple times. I think this person had a familiarity with this home that you would not find with even a casual friend. To understand the way the staircase worked, to understand where the bedrooms are laid out on so many floors. This is not just a typical 2-bedroom home. There's multiple floors. And to know how to get someone from a 3rd floor all the way down to the basement, where you know of a room that is difficult to get to, right? We saw this from the multiple searches. It's kind of a difficult room to figure out how to work because it's not really a usable room. It is a storage room. To know these sorts of things demonstrates incredible familiarity with the home. Now remember, the Ramseys were social people. They had open doors for the most part. I bet you at these parties, the doors probably were not locked. They probably had friends coming in and out all the time. I'm envisioning somewhat like the Home Alone house when, the ultimate robber is casing the place like a policeman and he kind of just walks in the front door. He can't even get anyone to notice them. I envision that sort of an openness in their home, especially during their social events. They are people in town they are the people to know, and there are people coming in at all times. This person could have found their way in, working the party, at the party, legitimately invited, or claimed to be a friend of a friend at the party. But I think he had been in that home multiple times based on his familiarity with the layout of the home. The second thing, I think he went in that home that day with the intent to kill JonBenét. I don't think he had another plan, tried to remove JonBenét, tried to kidnap her, and all he wanted was $118,000 from John. I think the whole purpose of all of this was to play John and play him like a monkey, like a wind-up monkey, to be the puppeteer of John. I think there was some weird obsession with either John's power or John's prestige in his company or just in society in general. And it was a show of power to address the note to John, to name his bonus amount. I don't think he really cared. I don't think he meant to get the money. I think this was all to make John jump when he said jump. Go get the $118,000. You know, kind of like of course you can get $118,000. Who can get $118,000? You can, John. That's so disgusting of you. Kind of like that sort of a tone. And the note was not long because he'd been obsessing over this for so long. He may have written this note in his head many times. I think he did write it in the house, but I think this had been something he had been obsessing over, dreaming over. We've talked about serial killers, like the killer in Delphi, how the killer in Delphi dreamed of that moment for, you know, time untold, and they knew exactly what they were going to do. I think this killer knew exactly what he was going to do, and he chose the day. He knew that they were going to leave the next day. He knew that everyone would be exhausted coming home from a party, exhausted from a day off your normal schedule because it was Christmas, and they would maybe not be as alert, or it would just wreak ultimate havoc to have such a tragedy strike around the happiest time of the year, that forever this would be a devastating time for John and his family. And as for JonBenét, I agree he definitely had, you know, pedophilic tendencies. I don't know that JonBenét was the reason. I do think it was tied to the Ramsey family, and she was kind of like the crown jewel, right? She was the one at the pageant. She was the one at parades and waving and doing her dance performances, and she was this beautiful young girl who was a symbol of how successful they were, that she was beautiful, that she was social, and she was winning things, and she was like a symbol for everything he was obsessed with or hated or loved, and it's a fine line between those two, of the Ramseys. I don't think he went in there for the sole purpose of just JonBenét. And unfortunately for him, you know, he of course he was attracted to her in the sick way, but also she represented kind of the crown jewel of this family of four in this house. And to take him down was by taking away their crown jewel in this horrific manner. That's going more into the behavioral profile or the mind of the killer. And the reality, Brett, is just there is no theory right now with the evidence we have that we could go to court with. We cannot convict an intruder at this point, because I can't even name an intruder, any of the family members, with what we have. And that's partly why there is so much debate, because we are faced with an utterly incomplete picture. It's not just a puzzle missing a couple pieces. There are just complete cannon holes through this puzzle that we've been handed. We're not even sure the puzzle pieces are facing the right way. We may be looking at the back of the puzzle where there's no picture. That's how messed up the entire case is, really. And it makes it such a tragic case, because as of right now, as it stands, I don't think this case will be solved. And that makes me so utterly sad for JonBenét and for everyone who knew and loved her. And here's one other thing I want to say about the intruder theory. I know a lot of people resist intruder theories because of how close it hits home. It's so much easier to say, Patsy's crazy. She wanted a beauty queen, and this was not what she bargained for, so she killed her daughter. Burke is a weird kid, so he killed his sister. John, I don't know, just loved his family and wanted to help save his, wife or son, and so he covered up the murder. Those you can put into a crazy box and say, that's not my family. But intruder, much more terrifying. Anyone could be watching your home, can be watching you and every movement you make, and you don't know it. An intruder throws the world that you think is in order into chaos, and it terrifies people. It terrifies me. And I know that typically makes me want to not believe in an intruder theory in any case, because an intruder theory means the world that I try so hard to put into order is in fact in absolute chaos and disarray, and that shakes me to my core.
And look, intruders are rare. I mean, that's just a fact. It doesn't happen that often, so you shouldn't be too worried about it when you're listening out there. It's not something that happens often. This would be an unusual thing, and a very unusual thing, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And I feel like sometimes people say, well, intruders are really rare, so therefore there wasn't an intruder. No, that's not right. There are intruders, and this might be a circumstance in which there was an intruder. We might be looking at that here. And because it's such a weird case, it almost seems like one where you would have an intruder. And Alice's theory is close to mine. I'm not sure which one is right, and I don't know that we ever will know. And I just want to clarify. I say you're not going to convince me that the parents did that. You're not going to convince me with theories. So you're not going to convince me just because you can put together a theory where Patsy did it that is internally consistent. You know, she woke up, she got mad, she struck JonBenét. She thought, what am I going to do? I'm going to stage the murder. She staged the murder. She wrote the note. She called the police. That is a theory. And there's nothing wrong with that theory, just as a theory. But what I need is some evidence. I need to see some evidence before I'm going to believe that. And there is no evidence in this case. And this is a problem. It's a big problem. And because of that, I think all you can do is look at what we've got and say, is there anything that indicates the parents are responsible? And I just don't see it. Like most of you, I grew up in the 90s. I remember this case. I spent most of my life thinking the parents did it. I just assumed they did it. You know, I always thought the Burke theory was weak and weird, and I just didn't buy it. And when we started looking into this case, very quickly I realized that, in my opinion at least, there's nothing to support the Burke theory. And the more we looked at it, the more I thought there was nothing to support the parents did it theory. The more I looked at it, the more I thought, this is an intruder. And I just couldn't get away from that. And I read Steve Thomas's book, and it's a really good book, and you should all read it. But when you read it, I want you to pay attention to when he presents evidence against Patsy, because it doesn't happen that often. And I kept waiting. I kept waiting for him to give me the summation of the evidence against Patsy, and he just never did it. It's you know, she was there. We don't see any evidence of an intruder. She wore the same clothes the next day. That's about it. And there were some fibers, and that's about it. He didn't have much more than that, and I was really disappointed in that. And let me be clear, I know we've expressed some really strong opinions on this episode and on all these episodes, just like we always do, but I'm not telling you that you're wrong if you think, you know, Patsy was involved. If you look at the behavior of the family and you think it's striking, we talk about behavior a lot. I don't think people should be convicted on behavior. I think you have to be careful with it. I think personally it doesn't tell you a whole lot, but the fact of the matter is, as human beings in society, we judge people based on their behavior all the time. So when you've got that sort of creeping feeling in the back of your neck, I'm not going to tell you to ignore it. But I do think some of that is based on misinformation. And the problem with this case is that there is so much information and so much that is stated as fact that is not fact. I'll give you a couple examples. We talked about the beaver fur that was found on JonBenét's body. And you'll hear people say that Patsy had beaver fur boots. And I think that comes from an early report by the police that they wanted to test a pair of Patsy's fur boots to see if they matched the beaver fur, because the beaver fur was obviously an important piece of evidence to the police. You already had the fibers from Patsy's clothes that she was wearing the night, but they weren't all that probative. It's not surprising that JonBenét had fibers on her consistent with the clothes that Patsy was wearing that night, the last time that she saw her alive. But if you have both the beaver fur and the fibers and they all come from Patsy, then that's much stronger. So the police, they went through the entire house, taping the floor, taking pieces of tape and putting them sticky side down on the carpet to pick up any fibers that might be there. That's what they do when they're looking for fiber evidence. They did it in all the closets, they did it in the bedrooms, and they could not find a single piece of beaver fur in that house. And that's a big strike against the theory that Patsy did it, because that would seem to indicate there are fibers on that body that come from outside the house. But now, if you mention the beaver fur, invariably someone will claim that Patsy had beaver fur boots. And there's really no proof that she did. And the fact that they couldn't find any other beaver fur in that house is almost definitive that she didn't. But that's the kind of misinformation you're dealing with. And you'll see the same thing with a ransom note. When we talked about the ransom note, we read you the conclusions of the only 6 experts to actually look at the note. But if you look for discussion online, what you'll find is a different expert's opinion, who never looked at the actual note itself, who pulled letters out of the ransom note and out of Patsy's writings and then compared them and concluded that Patsy wrote the note and did a nice little chart where you can look at the letters side by side. And it seems pretty convincing, but there's some big problems with it. First, anyone who does handwriting analysis will tell you that this kind of letter comparison is fraught with danger because we all learn to write in basically the same way. And you'll always be able to find some letters that are similar between two people, even if their handwriting is actually pretty different. But the bigger problem that I have is that this same expert first offered to work for the Ramseys to use the exact same analysis to show that Patsy didn't write the note. And when that didn't work out, and she was hired by the plaintiffs in the case that we talked about, the federal case we talked about, to perform this handwriting analysis, she couldn't even get qualified as an expert, and her testimony was excluded. The things you're seeing online, the court said, no, that's not credible. We're not going to look at that. So you can point to her findings as proof if you want, but these are some pretty serious problems with doing so. But honestly, that's just kind of this case. This case is filled with contradictory information. And we said that from the very beginning. And I think that's one reason sometimes people try and fall back on Occam's razor and claim that the simplest explanation here is the parents did it. Maybe. Certainly the case that all things being equal, it's more likely that a child found murdered in her home was killed by the parents. But all things aren't equal in this case. I think there's a couple things that are important to remember. The first is that Occam's razor is a tool, not a solution. Number one, it doesn't always work. You find two people murdered in their Silver Lake home, the simplest answer is not that they were murdered by a drugged-out sex cult trying to start a race war so that cult could rule over a post-apocalyptic world. But that's exactly what happened when the Manson family murdered the LaBiancas. Number two, you have to apply Occam's razor to the facts of the case. People will tell you that everything used in the crime came from the house. But that is not necessarily true. We've never found the cord used in this case. We've never found the source of the duct tape. We just talked about the beaver fur. We've never found the source of the animal hairs on JonBenét Ramsey's hands. And it's quite possible we've never found the murder weapon either. There's no evidence that anything in that house killed JonBenét. If you believe that she was killed by a flashlight or the corner of a bathtub, you believe that those things struck her with the force of a fall from a 3-story building onto her head without leaving a single trace of evidence behind. Not a dent, not a hair, nothing. If you think the simplest answer to this case is that her parents sexually assaulted their dying daughter with a paintbrush before choking the life out of her with a garrote after she was fatally struck on the head with that kind of crushing blow, all because of a piece of a pineapple or a bedwetting incident that, by the way, was so common it had become part of the family's everyday routine, I'm not going to tell you that you're wrong, but I don't think that is the solution that best accounts for the little evidence we have, and I don't think it's necessarily the simplest solution either. And I don't know, this is a crazy case that was ruined by the police early on and became so much fodder for tabloids that I think the general perception of what happened that day is just devoid of really any sort of evidentiary anchors that you can work from. And that's unfortunate. And it's really unfortunate for Burke, who grew up his whole life his sister being murdered in his home and then him being accused of doing it. I can't even imagine what he went through. And the fact that he probably didn't do it, that he almost certainly didn't do it, man, what a tragedy. I mean, it's like tragedy upon tragedy upon tragedy. It's a really sad case. It's really depressing. I've enjoyed covering it and discussing it with you guys, but man, I mean, what a tragedy this case was.
I hear you drinking over there, and that's exactly what we all need. It is a tall drink, a strong drink.
Yeah, I got some bourbon for this case. Decided to celebrate the end with a glass of bourbon.
I mean, I've enjoyed going through this case with you, Brett. We've been talking about doing this case since before we even started the podcast, and I'm glad we did it because it's like climbing an Everest, but it makes me so sad because of all the injustices and the vicarious trauma that has come. It's already sad enough that JonBenét was so brutally murdered, but the vicarious trauma that came from that as well is devastating.
And look, I know there's going to be a lot of people out there who disagree with us, and that's fine. As we've said on the gallery, you can completely disagree with us, and that's fine. No one has to agree with us to listen to this show. And there's going to be competing views, and there's going to be people who feel strongly that we're wrong, and that is 100% okay. That's what we want. We want more discussion, not less. We want more people challenging preconceived notions and being willing to discuss things they disagree with with each other. And that's a really important thing to do, particularly in when you're looking for truth. I mean, if you're not throwing your ideas out there into sort of the public arena and seeing how they stand up, then you never will have any idea whether your theories hold up or not. And I think it's really important. And I'm so glad to see people doing it and doing it respectfully. And we just have the best listeners in the world, and just, really happy and proud to do this show for you guys. So I hope you enjoy it. Well, this has been controversial. We sure you have thoughts. Shoot us an email, prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod on social media. The gallery on Facebook is a great place to have discussion. We also have a subreddit on Reddit where I know they talk about some of these cases, and where you can also suggest cases that you want us to cover. Shout out to those of you watching on YouTube or listening to this a couple weeks early on Patreon. Thank you to you guys for all the support you give us. Just want to remind you that we will be in Las Vegas for CrimeCon. Use code prosecutors for 10% off. We would love to see you there. We can even talk about the JonBenét Ramsey case. A couple things I want to say. If you are interested in reading more about this, obviously Scott Thomas's book will present to you the theory that Patsy did it. Foreign Faction will present to you the theory that Burke did it. I don't think that's a great book, but if you want to get that theory, that's a good way to get it. If you want to, the theory that John did it is Cyril Wecht's book, which is crazy. I mean, it's a crazy book, but you'll probably enjoy it. But just don't put a lot of stock into it, because Cyril Wecht has pretty insane theories about basically every case he's ever looked at. And then obviously there's the Ramsey's book. The Other Side of Suffering, I think, is John's book. Death of Innocence is the parents' book. And then there's Paula Woodward's book, which presents sort of the Ramsey position and does so forcefully. So just know that there's going to be some obvious bias when you read that book. If you want to listen to some podcast on this, True Crime Garage does 6-part series. It's very good. I think it ends up in a similar place we did, so you may get a little of the same thing. If you're looking for the other side, I know Generation Y has done a few shows on this, and I think they are pretty firmly in the camp that someone in the family was involved, so you can get that perspective from them. Well, Alice, is there anything else you want to say before we sign off for today?
No, but if you have not liked this series, we have a new case for you next week, so come on back.
So exciting. New case next week. New questions, new answers, and nothing about JonBenét Ramsey. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. I mean, the thing is, there's no case. People talk about us being biased, which is just hilarious. Like, there's no case that... The only case that I'm probably biased on is Dyatlov Pass. Like, you will never convince me it's an avalanche. I don't care what you do. I mean, nobody's actually presented a convincing argument.
That is, like, following the evidence. Like, also,
Yeah.
I'm not going to believe it was because they all committed suicide. Something ridiculous,
Right.
Like, because
Right.
there's literally no evidence for that.
And I don't know. I go into these cases, and I usually have, when I start the research, a preconceived notion. But there's all sorts of times that I'm like, oh, that's not right. I just don't get it. I was, 15 years old or whatever when this happened. my opinions were the same opinions as everybody. The parents did it.
Right.
You know, I've always thought the Burke thing was dumb. I've always thought the Burke thing was just ridiculous. But I always thought the parents probably did it just because that's what everybody thought. And then we started looking at it, and I was like, okay, they didn't do it. I don't understand.
Watch Yellowstone for free on PlutoTV. All this weekend, PlutoTV is streaming a marathon of seasons 1 to 3 of Yellowstone, the show The Wrap calls a smash hit series. PlutoTV also has hundreds of channels and thousands of movies and TV shows like Mission Impossible 3, Gladiator, CSI, and more. Absolutely free. So download the free Pluto TV streaming app and watch Yellowstone seasons 1 to 3 free.